Much. Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along and welcome to Figuring Out Phonics. Today, we're going to think about what we do to teach our children to learn to read, our earliest readers, how we teach phonics, what we do in schools and how we can help at home. So I'm going to start off with the purpose of why we teach reading. We know that reading is the key to success. We know that reading unlocks unlimited potential in our children. It enables children to access all other subjects and allows children to escape into different magical worlds. That's why reading is so key in schools. That's why schools put so much emphasis on the teaching of reading, because the quicker a child learns to read, as soon as they've learned to read, they then will be able to read to learn, and they'll be able to access anything that you give them. So reading is always the key. The purpose of today is to first of all learn what the reading framework, the most current reading framework, says about phonics and children with SEND. We're going to learn the fundamentals of phonics and find out what your child will learn at school and then how you can help at home. So let's start off with thinking from an SEND perspective through that lens. For some children who have SEND, actually reading might not be an issue anyway, but if it is, then sometimes a little bit of extra support is actually enough for that child. It might be that the school puts in some really regular informal assessment to check where that child is at, what their next steps are, and how we can move them on with their reading journey. That they get put into a small group booster session. That might just be a small group of maybe 3 or 4 children who are having a bit of phonics booster through the day. They might have more review through the day, so they might be seeing that sound more times through the day. We know they need to see it more times for it to go into their orthographic store, which is their long-term memory. And if we do all of these things, they will then keep up with their peers. So for some children, that little extra is enough. We know that the reading framework focuses heavily on all children, including those with SEND. I'm going to read you some quotes from the reading framework now. Literacy is as important for these children as for their peers, and teachers should be ambitious about teaching them to read and write. These children have to navigate the same written language, unlock the same alphabetic code, learn the same skills, and learn and remember the same body of knowledge as their peers. It is a critical skill in helping them prepare for adulthood. Schools are expected to enable access to appropriate phonics instruction for children with complex needs. Under the Equality Act, they're required to make reasonable adjustments to enable pupils with disabilities to have full access to the curriculum and to be able to participate in it. Consensus is growing among academics and teachers that the best reading instruction for children with SEND is systematic synthetic phonics, taught by direct instruction. They can learn to read and write and make progress towards or attain functional literacy. In a 2021 study of children with learning disabilities, findings suggest that students with SEND benefit from phonics-based programs. And the view that children learn to read in different ways is now under scrutiny. It is simply not true that there are hundreds of ways to learn to read. Every child is unique, but when it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints and the same learning sequence. And that's all from the reading framework that was released in 2021 and updated yearly. Evidence suggests that most children with moderate to severe and complex needs are not visual learners as previously thought. For instance, in a small study found no evidence of prominent visual learning style in children with ASD, while Kathy Colligan has noted that for children with Down syndrome, sight word learning on its own is insufficient for reading development, and teaching with this approach alone is contrary to current evidence-based practices in literacy instruction. Phonics, rather than a whole word approach, provides children with moderate to severe and complex needs the best opportunity to gain that functional literacy. Children who have a hearing or visual impairment are generally able to access phonics teaching if they have some hearing or vision. And again, those are all quotes from the reading framework. Let's have a look at children with ASD. A recent systematic review for children with autism concluded comprehensive instruction that incorporates phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, reading fluency, and reading comprehension is not only appropriate for children with autism, but also effective. Now let's have a look at what Ofsted say. Schools assume, mistakenly, that if pupils are struggling with reading, then phonics has not worked and pupils must need something different. But understanding the alphabetic code, that letters on the page represent the sounds in spoken words, is the basis for successful word reading. Study upon study show that children who have been diagnosed with developmental conditions learn to decode words by relying on the same processes as other readers. A different curriculum, such as teaching pupils to read word by sight, may appear to offer short-term success, but it will not provide a long-term strategy for decoding unfamiliar words. Some pupils with SEND will probably need a lot more practice to secure important phonic knowledge. This does not mean phonics is not working. It just means we need to think really carefully about how best to help pupils secure this knowledge. For example, it may be more helpful for pupils to be in a small group, breaking the learning into smaller steps and repeating the steps more to increase overlearning. And that's come from the latest education inspection blog. So I've just given you a load of quotes from different articles to summarise what this is saying then. Children with SEND should be taught to learn to read using phonics. It shouldn't be any different to any other child. Sight reading, which is what we previously thought might be better for a child with SEND, sight reading isn't a thorough enough strategy for any children, including those with SEN. We need to adapt the delivery, but not the programme. So actually doing things like teaching that child in a smaller group, or teaching them one-to-one, or breaking the learning down into smaller steps, or repeating the learning more, that's what we should be doing with a child who has SEN. We shouldn't be adapting the programme or changing something because we feel it's not working. And that's what Ofsted is saying, that schools mistakenly think this is not working for that child, but actually it is. It's just that it needs to be broken down into smaller steps, and that child might be making smaller steps of progress. So what should happen in schools then? Let's have a think about the kind of intervention that we should see in schools for our children with SEND. We should see a daily one-to-one reading intervention. This needs to be one-to-one rather than in a small group, because really the teacher or TA or whoever's working with that child needs to be targeting their particular gaps and working with that specific child on their reading journey. It should be a consistent adult. So maybe a TA that is full-time, that's in the whole week, should be working with that child one-to-one every day consistently. Their targets need to be really rigorously tracked. So learning to read is a very clear step-by-step process, and we'll see that process later on in the presentation. And actually, if we're tracking those targets, it might be that the child is making small steps of progress, but we should be seeing ticking off of targets every week, every 2 weeks, where that child is learning those small steps of learning to read. We're teaching in small steps. So we know that one particular child may not learn to read at the same pace as another child. That's fine, as long as they are making their own progress. It might be small steps, but that's okay. And they should always be using the school's chosen phonics programme. So if the school has chosen a particular programme, which every school has to teach a phonics programme that's been validated by the Department for Education, that programme needs to be retaught to that child. We're not adding in anything new, we're not adding in a different programme, because actually that just confuses things even more. So where we might have that viewpoint of, oh, this particular programme's not working because the child's not making enough progress, that's not what we want. We want to stick with the programme, be consistent, and just understand that the steps of progress might be smaller. We're making sure that we're using familiar routines to the children. So whatever the program uses, it might be that they've got a specific jargon or language or routines for reading. We're using those same routines in that one-to-one intervention. We're making sure that the resources and materials we're using are the same as what the others are having in their whole class phonics or their whole group phonics, that we're limiting distraction. We're not adding in lots of extra resources because that can often distract children. That we're providing plenty of opportunity for overlearning. So if we're teaching, for example, the single letter sounds, if we're at the very beginning of the reading journey, the child is having the opportunity to see those sounds over and over and over through the day. This is your new sound of the day, let's look at it, because we know that the more times they see that sound, the quicker it's going to go into their orthographic store. It's at a suitable pace for them, so we're working with the child. We're not deciding this is the pace we're using and this is what we do. We're making sure that we're reading the child, we're working with what they can do, and that we're engaging and motivating, that we use our body language, our facial expressions to show them how proud we are, how well they're doing. We're really motivating them through those small steps of progress. In these one-to-one sessions, the emphasis should always be on that grapheme-phoneme correspondence, and we'll have a look shortly on what that looks like. So it's the representation or the relationship between the sounds that we hear and the representation of those sounds on the page. Practicing blending to be able to blend sounds into words. And reading words by saying the sounds and blending them. So that's what we should be seeing in those one-to-one sessions. Primarily, that's the most important thing that we can teach our children, is those grapheme phoneme correspondences, and then being able to blend those together. So figuring out phonics, let's have a think about what phonics is, what those stages are of learning to read, and how we can help. So phonics is our alphabetic code. Phonics is learning what sounds the letters on the page represent. It tells us the sounds the letters make when we see them written down. The letters are all telling us something. Some are tall, some are short, some are straight, some are curled. We know what those letters say, but children don't. So we have to help them to understand that all those letters on the page are trying to tell us a message. They're trying to tell us a sound. And we need to remember what that sound is when we see that letter on the page. Each letter or collection of letters, when it comes to 2 or 3 letters making one sound, tells us that sound. The letters are like little symbols. We know what these symbols say, but children don't yet. And that's what we're teaching when we're teaching phonics. To learn to read, a child has to learn what each symbol says. And that is phonics. And understandably, it's a skill that takes years to master. Let's think about us as adults. We often don't need to use our phonics because actually we can read every word that we see at a glance. However, there might be some words that come up that we do need to rely on phonics for. Let's have a think about this word here. I'm not going to read it out to you, I just want you to read it on the screen. I want you to think about how you are reading this word. So just sound it out in your head and see if you can work out what the word is. Okay, so this word is Styracosaurus. If any of you have got dinosaur obsessed children at home, you'll know what a Styracosaurus is. For those of you who haven't, lucky you, it's here on the page. So you can see it's a herbivore dinosaur, a bit like a Triceratops, part of the Triceratops family, I'm guessing. So what we're doing as adults is we're probably breaking this into chunks. We're not breaking it into every single sound because we're using our brain to make the most helpful collections of letters that we can see. So for me, I'm looking at first sty, and then racco, and then saurus, because saurus is a very familiar chunk in my orthographic store already. So I'm relying on that orthographic store to be able to read saurus. I'm looking at the sty and then the raccosaurus, and that's how I've broken it up. I can now read this word at a glance because it's already in my orthographic store. I've read the word Styracosaurus so many times over the last year and a half since my son became obsessed with dinosaurs that that word is now in my orthographic store, and I don't need to do that breaking down anymore. However, if I were to open a book and to see a name of a dinosaur that I'd never seen before, so let's pretend Styracosaurus is completely new to me, I'm going to be doing some sort of phonic decoding to work out what it says. And it might be that your decoding was different to mine. Like I said, I broke it into Styracosaurus. You might have broken it into Styracosaurus. And that's okay. Your brain is finding the most useful chunks of letters that it can. You're drawing on all that knowledge from your orthographic store, which is the part of your brain that stores all of the language. And in drawing upon that, you're finding those most useful collections of letters for you to be able to read that word quickly. But once you've read it enough times, you will now be able to read it at a glance because it's then in your orthographic store. Once it's in my orthographic store, phonics has served us and we can wave it goodbye. I can now read that word at a glance. I don't need to decode it any longer. Great, I can read. And then I use my phonics for the next dinosaur name that comes up that I haven't yet seen and is not yet in my orthographic store. When we learn to read, we look at a word, think about us reading Styracosaurus. We break the word into its individual sounds. We say those sounds, and then we put the word back together again. That is what we call decoding. That is reading those individual words. So when your kids' teachers say they've got good decoding skills, this is what decoding is. There's no speed or fluency in decoding. It's just doing those very fundamentals where we're looking at the word, breaking it into its sounds, saying the sounds, and then putting that word back together again. When we're spelling, we do the opposite. We reverse it. We think of the word we want to write, think of the whole word. So we're going sort of from bottom back to top. Think of the whole word. Then we say the sounds we can hear in the word. We have to retrieve from memory what those sounds look like when they're written down. We have to retrieve what the letters are. Are they tall? Are they short? Are they curved? Are they straight? And then we write them. And that is what we call encoding. So we've got decoding, which is our learning to read, encoding, which is our learning to spell. Let's have a look at some jargon busting here. So I've already briefly mentioned some of these terms. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that you can hear in a word. A phoneme is one unit. So for example, in the word cat, you've got 3 units of sound. You've got k and a and t. Those are 3 separate phonemes. I'm just going to pause there just to double check. You can see my PowerPoint, can't you, that's coming up? Sorry, Camilla, can you just let me know? Because I've just suddenly seen on
we can see it. Okay. Yeah.
You can see all the text.
Just jargon busting and phoneme.
Okay, you can. Sorry. On the control panel, all I can see is the front picture, and I suddenly panicked thinking I'm just going through it and you can't see it. You can, it's fine. Thank you. Okay, jumping back in. All right, so phoneme, that smallest unit of sound that you can hear in a word. The grapheme is the visual representation of that sound. It's the sound written down, or the phoneme written down. So phoneme, think of phone, what you can hear. Grapheme, think of graph, what you see, the visual representation. Phoneme grapheme correspondence, that's the GPC that we see, where we kind of see it in the framework. We're focusing on GPC. That is grapheme phoneme or phoneme grapheme correspondence. That's where children have a connection between the sound a and what a looks like as a letter, the letter A. So they're understanding that those two things are connected. In each word, there is a one-to-one phoneme grapheme correspondence. So for each sound that we hear in the word, there is always a grapheme to write it down to see. So for example, in the word dog, we've got 3 phonemes, d, o, g, and we've got 3 graphemes, the letter D, the letter O, the letter G. Those graphemes are the visual representations of the phonemes. Phonics is the link between the phonemes and the graphemes. English is a very complex code. Other languages have a much more simple code. So Spanish, for example, has just one grapheme for each phoneme in the language, with just a few exceptions. So I'm just going to pause and break this down. So in Spanish, they have however many phonemes that are in their words in their language. For each phoneme, there is just one grapheme to represent it. So for example, if you think about the sound E, in Spanish, we would expect one version of that sound E. However, in English, we have a very complex code. We often have a lot of graphemes that go with each phoneme, and that's why it takes our children longer to read and write in English. So let's take that sound E as an example. We have, as an example, E, like in the word green, E, like in the word dream, E, like in the word key, E, like in the word happy, E, like in the word key, as in a harbour key, E, like in me, E, like in Steve, E, like in ceiling, and E, like in chief. Now that E sound comes up in all of those words. E in green, E in dream, E in key, E in happy, E in key, E in me, E in Steve, E in ceiling, E in chief. It's exactly the same sound that comes up in all those different words. However, the way it's visually represented, the grapheme, is different in all of those different words. And that's why it's so hard to learn to read, but particularly to spell in English, because although there are spelling rules, there's nothing really to say why E in green is EE and not EA. It just is. We know it is because we're adults, we've seen that word enough times. But for a child, there is nothing telling them why it's EE and not EA. There's no rule for that one particularly. So for them, they have to learn the words enough, they have to have seen the words enough for them to be in their orthographic store, for them to then be able to spell those words accurately. English is a really complex code. So how do we do this? We teach the most common graphemes first. We teach them explicitly through a phonics lesson, where the child is learning that sound in isolation and then learning to apply that sound into words. However, we can't possibly teach every single grapheme in our whole language because there are like 200 of them. We couldn't teach every single one of those, it would be overwhelming. So for some of the less common graphemes, we do teach them maybe as they come up in words, but that really would be once a child has got through those basic stages of learning to read. Children learning to read and write in English have a harder task than other languages. So a child who's learning to read and write in Spanish has a much easier job than a child learning to read and write in English. In our phonics lessons, we're teaching those most common sounds in isolation. So here you can see a picture of me teaching ow to a group of children. When we see those two letters, they're making one sound, ow. So we're saying that actually when we see those graphemes, they might not just be one letter that's representing the sound. There might be 2 letters, 3 letters. Some even have 4 letters representing one sound. So it's 2 letters making one sound. We then learn to read that sound in words. So once they've learnt ow, they then will learn to read shout, loud, mouth, out, etc., where we see that grapheme in a word. And then they learn to spell those graphemes in words too. So once they've read shout, mouth, out, loud, they then spell that as well. When we have our storybooks, so lots of you I'm sure will have storybooks sent home, these are for practice with known sounds and words. So often phonics programs will be slightly ahead in their phonics lessons, and the children will be practicing the sounds in words they already know, that they know quite well, in their storybooks. So often I get questions on my Instagram, my Phonics Fairy Instagram, that say, my child is learning these sounds, but they're not in their books. And that's for a reason. It's because we want them to know them really well before they start applying that knowledge in their storybooks. So let's take a look at these different stages of learning to read. We've got initial sounds, so where we're learning those single letter sounds. We're not looking at the digraphs where we have two letters making one sound. We're just looking at those single letter sounds from the alphabet. We then learn to blend those sounds into words, stage 2 or step 2. Step 3, we're learning the consonant digraphs. So for example, we've got sh, qu and ch. Then we read those digraphs in words. We then learn the long vowel digraphs and we read those in words as well. And once we can do that, we work on our fluency and our speed of reading. No matter what phonics program the school teaches, these are the steps of learning to read. So let's first of all have a look at initial sounds or single letter sounds and have a think about how that happens in school. These are the single letter sounds, the letters of the alphabet, if you like. The school might use in their phonics program a hook to help children remember. So for example, you can see on the screen here, we've got on one side of the card, and on the other side, we've got a girl standing next to some mountains. The children learn that on the one side, they say mountain, and on the other side, they say This is a program that uses a picture hook to help. Other programs use maybe a song or an action to help, but often a program will use some sort of hook. So if you would like to help at home, good thing to do is to check what the hook is, how they're helping them to remember those sounds, and which resources they're using as well. This is the letters of the alphabet, except qu, because we never see the letter Q on its own. We always see it with a U, so that then becomes a digraph. So our initial sounds are all those letters of the alphabet, except qu. We pronounce them without the on the end, which we call a schwa. So we say not m. We say s, not s. Let's take a look at these initial sounds and I'll just pronounce them for you so that you can see. We'll just go across the rows so that you can follow along. So we've got a, b, k, d, e, g, h, I, j, k, l, m, n, o, p, r, s, t, a, v, w, x, y, z. So that's how each of those sounds is pronounced. And in a phonics lesson, they would be taught, as I said, using that hook. And normally we just teach one of those each day. Again, depends on the child. The pace that we can go might just change depending on who we're working with. Our next stage is blending sounds into words. This is hard. Blending is really tricky and it's often a huge stumbling block for children. Once a child has a handful of single letter sounds, they learn to blend the sounds to read a word. So here, as you can see, we've got b, I, g. We blend to read big. And that's why we keep that that schwa at the end as clipped as possible to help them blend. If we think about saying those sounds with a schwa on, b, I, g, if we're blending b, I, g, b, I, g, b, I, g, it doesn't sound anything like big, which is why we keep the sounds really pure. B, I, g, big. You can see that those three sounds, we can hear the blend into the word. K, at, cat, n, men. So we're seeing that we're blending those sounds into words. Blending is really hard, it's tricky. We model blending until a child can do this independently. There are some nice things you can do at home to think about your blending with a child. So if they're struggling with blending, the first step is to actually do some oral blending, which is where we are just saying the sounds orally without anything in front of us and seeing if the child can blend the sounds together to say the words. So you might say, oh, look outside, I can see the s, sun, and you're just adding into that everyday conversation to help them hear the sounds in words. Once a child can blend, and that can take a little while for some children to actually get over that blending hurdle, we then start teaching the consonant digraphs. So where we first see two letters making one sound, and that's what a digraph is in terms of that jargon, two letters making one sound. The first 6 digraphs are consonant digraphs. So we've got ch, sh, th, qu, and then we've got 2 extras, like in sing, and unk, like in think. Again, the school might use that hook to help. They might have an action, they might have a picture to help the child really be able to remember that sound. Here you go, here are the consonant digraphs written out on the screen. So we've got sh like in ship, ch like in chip, th like in think, like in sing, qu like in quit, and unk like in think. Once the child can read words with the consonant digraphs in, they're then able to move on to the vowel digraphs, the long vowel digraphs. Just going back a step to our consonant digraphs, when children are reading these in words, if the digraph is at the end of the word, or even if it's at the beginning, sometimes they struggle to see that digraph. So when my son was first learning these, for example, if the word was ship, he would say ip. He hadn't spotted that those two together make one sound. So what we were doing was making sure that he looked for it first, found the digraph first, and then went back to read the word from the beginning. So getting them to look for the digraph first is a really good tip. Once they can do this, we then move on to the vowel digraphs and trigraphs. So again, this is 2 letters or 3 letters making one sound. There are 12 vowel digraphs. I'm just going to read them out, but there are alternative graphemes as well, which we'll have a look at in a moment. So we've got A, E, I, O, U, R, O, ow, and oi. Those are the 12 sounds the children learn, but there are way more graphemes than this because we have 2, 3, 4, sometimes graphemes representing just one sound, like we saw with that example for E. Children learn the letters representing these 12 vowel sounds, and then they learn the alternatives. So they learn that AY in the word play makes the sound A, but also AI makes the sound A in the word snail or rain or tail. So we then learn that we have the same sound but different spelling, and that's called the alternative grapheme. Let's take a look at all of these different vowel digraphs and trigraphs then. I'll go from, again, top row down to the bottom. We've got A like it sounds in play, E like in sleep, I like in light, O like in snow, but it also, this one, makes the sound ow like in cow, U like in zoo, also makes the sound like in cook, R like in car, or like in fork, air like in fair, as in bird, ow like in loud, and oi like in boy. And then if we look at some alternatives, we've got E like in dream, oi like in boil, ow like in cow, or like in straw, like in hurt, like in butter, A like in snail, O like in boat, and U like in stew. We then have what we call split digraphs, and we have some trigraphs here as well. The split digraphs we used to think of as like a magic E or a silent E. Actually, it's not a silent E, it's not magic, it is part of the digraph. It is still two letters making one sound. However, it's been split. So if we think about a word like name, if we didn't have that E on the end, it would say nam. But the E on the end helps the letter A to become the letter A, or to become the sound A. So those are split up. There's still a digraph, but we call them the split digraphs. So if your kids are saying magic E, silent E, and that's maybe something that I remember actually learning that as a kid, the magic E, silent E. It's not magic, it's not silent, it's part of the digraph. It's just that they've been split up and another letter sits in between them. So the split digraphs, we've got A like in name, E like in Steve, I like in smile, O like in home, and U or U like in huge or cute. And then we've got some final trigraphs. Aya like in fire, ear like in hear, your like in pure, and air like in care. We use sound buttons and dashes to help children identify where those digraphs and trigraphs sit in a word. So let's have a look at some examples, and then I'm going to get you to have a go on your own. So let's look at some examples first. I'm just going to hold this up to the camera. Okay, so here, let's look at the word dog. Just give me a shout, Camilla, if you can't see this. So we've got three sounds in dog. So the sound buttons we would see would be that one, D, O, and G. Three phonemes, three graphemes, three sound buttons. The word ship, we've got a digraph, so we would underline that because we see that underlined, and then we'd see the sound button for I and a sound button for P. The drop, that's four sounds. Now this is in that blending stage when we're looking at blending words together, but often children can get stuck on a word like drop because we're seeing two consonants sat together. Now we used to call these consonant clusters, but we don't really call them this anymore. If a child knows their sounds and they can blend, then they don't need to learn it as a cluster. And I think that was a bit of like an old-fashioned thing to do, which we don't do anymore. However, if you see any kind of paperwork or whatever that says anything about consonant clusters, that's what it's talking about, where two consonants sit together. So other words include jump, where we've got MP at the end, frog, like the F and the at the beginning, drop, drip, words like that. So where we've got those two consonants sat together. And often children get quite stuck on that stage of learning to read, where they're learning words with four sounds. The best thing you can do there is to model how to read that word first, really emphasizing the tricky part of the word, the d, op, drop, and helping the child to see that those two with a blend that we hear when we're reading it. So here we've got four different sounds, d, o, p in drop. Let's have a look at lemon, which is a multi-syllabic word. So we've got two syllables in this word. We've got lem and on, but again, they're all single letter sounds. U, e, o, lemon. We'll take a look at some with some digraphs in now. So here, the word neat, we've got e, t, and then we've got phone. These two are making the sound. Then we've got O, which is a split digraph, and then there. Okay, so you can see that split there. If we didn't have that one on the end, it would say phon. It doesn't. It's helping that one to say O. It's a split digraph. Okay, so now that I've shown you some, I'm going to get you to have a go yourself. So if you could just write out these words: cat, chin, flag, pumpkin, snail, and cake. Then have a go, dot and dashing those words. I'm going to do it myself so I can show you, and you can give yourself some ticks in a minute. Okay, I'm just going to do my own dot and dashing now, and then we'll mark them together. Okay, let's mark. So cat, you should have 3 sound buttons. Chin, you should have 1 dash and 2 blobs. Flag, 1, 2, 3, 4 sound buttons. Pumpkin, although it's a longer word, all single letter sounds. P, a, m, p, k, I, n, pumpkin. Snail, s, n, a is the digraph, all. And then cake, you've got your k, your a, your split a, and your k, k, ache, cake. Fingers crossed you got those right. If you didn't, hopefully that's cleared up and you can understand why those sounds are the way they are. Okay, our final stage then of learning to read is building up speed and fluency. Now with these other steps, everything I've shown you, a lot of it is just about repetition, learning the code, learning how to blend. They're kind of very secretarial skills, if you like, and they're easily trackable. You've learnt your single letter sounds, great, now we learn to blend. You've learnt to blend, great, now we learn our consonant digraphs. You've learnt your consonant digraphs, great, we learn to read them in words. Now we learn our vowel digraphs, and now we learn to read them in words. So those very small steps of reading can be very easily tracked through. Building speed and fluency is kind of the big one at the very end, because actually this is the part that so many children struggle on, that they're really good decoders, but actually being a good decoder doesn't mean you're yet a good reader. It means you will be a good reader, but actually decoding and fluency are 2 completely different things. So let's have a think about what we mean by speed and fluency. So being able to read at speed with fluency, we're looking at children being able to read at about 100 words a minute to be a speedy, fluent and comprehending reader. So for children to be able to understand what they're reading, we need them to be reading at about 100 words a minute. And that relies on very quick decoding, being able to read words at a glance. So be decoding so quickly that your brain is doing it before you've even realised. And that's when we make that change from being a decoding reader to a fluent and speedy reader. Some things you can do to help your children build their speed and fluency. You can teach the words that are going to appear in the story first. So if they're in those very early stages of learning to read, those little phonics books, you can teach those words first before they're going to read them in the story, because hopefully if they're reading them for the second time in the story, they'll be able to read them more quickly at a glance rather than having to decode all those individual sounds. Encourage them to sound out in their head. So something I say to the children is close your mouth and whisper it behind your lips and then say the word. So encouraging them to internalize that sounding out. Encourage repeated readings. This is always tricky. I do find this one with my son where he doesn't want to read his storybook over and over, but I notice such a huge difference between the first time he's read it and the 4th time he's read it. It's a completely different read and a completely different purpose. You know, that first read is very slow, lots of decoding, lots of reading the tricky words. I'll come to tricky words in a minute. But by the 4th time he's read it, he's reading it at a glance. So encourage those repeated readings. Model how to read. sounding out in your head. So make sure that they're hearing you reading, knowing that what you're doing is sounding it out in your head and then reading it quickly. So they need to see that process. I'm going to sound this one out in my head and then I'm going to read it. And finally, it seems mad to just have this as one kind of final point, especially on World Book Day, but reading plenty of stories to them. I can't emphasize this enough. I've obviously, we've looked at phonics today because the title was Figuring Out Phonics, but the very, very best thing you can do for your children to help them learn to read is to read loads of lovely storybooks to them. On my Instagram every Sunday, I do like a story recommendation. And I always pin them. So in the little story highlights, I call it story time. And then I've sort of built up quite a lot of recommendations in there now. Just a lovely picture book, storybook that I would recommend because I've enjoyed it, my son's enjoyed it. And that's really going to expose them to so much. You know, words you don't use in everyday conversation, topics that you might need to talk about, those big topics that come up in those storybooks that are so helpful as a springboard for those good conversations. And just that bonding and that love and that calm down before bed is the best thing you can do reading a story. So read plenty of stories to them. That also will help their reading, their speed, their fluency, and their comprehension as well. So just a kind of quick one to just end that with the reading plenty of stories to them. I know that we're celebrating World Book Day today by thinking about phonics, but actually the most important thing you can do ever with your child in terms of helping them to learn to read is reading to them. To end then, let's just have a look at tricky words. So tricky words are common words. They're words that are high frequency, but with a grapheme that we don't often see. So for example, in the word said, that eh is tricky because we don't often see the letters AI making the sound eh. We show the children where that tricky bit is, and we have to just tell them these words. They essentially have to learn to read these words with whole word reading because it's very hard to sound out a tricky word. Explain that in this word, these letters or this letter makes this sound, and that's why it's tricky. But those other bits are okay. So for example, in the word said, this and the d are okay. It's the eh that doesn't look how we expect it to look. We would say the word and ask your child to repeat it. So the little steps here, we'd say this tricky word is said. These letters, pointing to the AI, are making the sound eh. This word is said. Now you read it, and we will get our child to just read the whole word. Okay, we're going to end there. So we've got 10 minutes for questions. Just again to reiterate, why is this so important? We know that reading is the key. Reading unlocks unlimited potential, enables children to access all their other subjects, and allows children to escape into different magical worlds. That's why schools put such a huge emphasis on learning to read, why it is so important, and why I do what I do with my phonics consultancy in my schools, but also with my Instagram account, because I feel like it's so important that parents know how their child's learning to read so that if they want to, they can support them at home as well. Thank you so much, Camilla. I will hand over to you for some questions, and just what we said before, Camilla, to everybody, if you don't get your question answered or if there's something that I need to kind of go away and think about and talk to you a bit more, please do just drop me a message on my Instagram, so DM me on Instagram. I often will send people voice notes back, which is sometimes easier than sort of typing it. But if there's something I need to just go away and think about, then send me a DM and I'll answer it there instead. Okay, Camilla, over to you for questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Amy. That was brilliant. It's really interesting, actually, because I'm at the phonics stage of my daughter, and when you break it all down and see it all, it could be, it's very overwhelming, isn't it, for like a young kid's brain to take all that in. But I suppose, like you say, it's just practice, isn't it, and reading constantly with them. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And we'll get through some of the questions. Like, if anyone does have any questions whilst we're doing the Q&A, if you can just post them in the control panel. We've had a couple in, so we'll start with, my 9-year-old son finds reading difficult and does not enjoy it. How can we help him want to read?
I would just read to him. Almost sometimes you just need to like take a little bit of a break from it. So instead of forcing him to read his storybooks at home, like his phonics storybooks or his, the storybooks he's been given to read at home, just pause on that, find out the books that he loves. So what kind of topic is there? Or, there's so many books out there that sort of gear towards different children. But I feel like there's especially a sort of collection of books that is aimed towards boys, about, you've got like Dinosaur Who Pooped a Planet and all those kind of books that the boys very stereotypically tend to love. So I would just put a pause on him practicing his own reading, read to him for a while, try to get that motivation and that love of reading back, and then sort of start to tackle him practicing his own reading at a different time. But I think if he's really finding it hard to be motivated to want to read, then the best thing to do is just take a pause and get going with lots of love of reading and really motivate him to want to read. The other thing as well is just think about your own reading. So, does he see you reading at home? And just think about that. So, could you get out a book and model this, I'm going to sit and do some reading of my book, and, showing how actually we love reading in our family, and sort of bringing it into that excitement of, I'm going to read my book, and do you want to read yours, or should we read it together? Trying to share that love of reading together.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question we've got, so my son is 18 and struggling at A level. He's been identified as a raw score 53 standardized score 117 87th percentile, but noticing he's making spelling mistakes in birthday cards. Is there a test you can do that looks at where he's going wrong with his spelling? He also has low rapid symbol naming and slow processing. Would this be connected to phonics skill?
Yeah, it sounds like it could be connected to phonics skill. Phonics is the first step for spelling, because so many of our words in English don't follow exactly the rule we want it to. So it might be that he's done, is he relying sort of on his phonics but without thinking about the grapheme choice he's making? I don't know necessarily about a spelling test that you can do to figure out where he's at. With that one, if you can drop me a note on my DM on my Instagram, I can just go away and have a little look for you and come back to you on that and just see. But it does sound, if he has got sort of slower processing and it's that symbol recognition, then of course that is phonics, because phonics is symbol recognition. So, but let me come back to you on the sort of standardized testing for spelling one.
Thank you. Someone's asking, is phonics covered in reception, or does it go into year one as well?
Yeah, phonics goes all the way from reception, year one and year two. Normally stops kind of at some point in year two for the children. However, there are some children, of course, who won't finish their phonics in year two. They still need it going into the high year group. So for some children, they might need it in year three, year four and beyond as well, and that's absolutely fine. We're working with those individual children, and wherever they are in their reading journey, they have to complete some sort of phonics learning to then be able to go and be sort of in that free reading, what schools call it, be a free reader. So they need to kind of get through that phonics first. That normally occurs reception, year one and in year two as well.
Thank you. Another one, so the alpha blocks are my son's current special interest, and he's in year two. Would it cause confusion for him if I work through their reading program at home while at his school are working on a different program? He's not been keeping up with the class anyway, as until recently he was non-speaking.
Okay. What I probably would do is talk to the school about what are they doing to help as well. They should be teaching him one-to-one if he's been non-verbal until recently. I like to hope they're doing that. I like to hope they're already teaching him one-to-one. It's hard, isn't it? My general advice is try to go with what the school are doing, because you don't want to kind of you don't want to do a program that is different, because it might confuse. However, if he's got a real special interest in alpha blocks, the only thing I'd say about alpha blocks, and I don't know it very well, but is that when I've sort of seen it, when I've been flicking through TV channels, is they use letter names rather than letter sounds, which I think can be a bit confusing. So for example, when they show the letter T, they say, this is the letter T, it makes the sound T. I just think adding those two different sounds in is confusing for me. I think I've always been very much, let's go to sounds first and then we can sort of tackle letter names at a different point. So maybe just be slightly careful with alpha blocks, but if he really loves it and you feel like he's going to make some progress with it, then maybe talk to the school. Of course, you know, you're his parent as well. It's up to you really what you decide to do. But I'd like to think that the school is helping you with what to do at home so that it replicates what he's doing in school. However, if alpha blocks is really going to motivate him, then probably go for it, I would say.
Thank you. Just a couple more. So can you recommend any phonics reading learning books for a pre-verbal autistic 4-year-old?
Okay, I wouldn't, so if he's pre-verbal, I wouldn't worry too much about him doing any pre-phonics books. You could do some non-verbal stuff with him in that if he knows sounds and he can blend, but he's just not verbalizing it, what you could do is write out some words and get some picture matching. So you could say, give him a little card with the word on, maybe it's d or good dog, and get him to match it with a picture that you've printed out. That's probably a good pre-verbal activity. Apart from that, I'd say just read to him. That's probably the best thing you can do to sort of help all of those things, you know, to help his language and that development as well. So instead of him just kind of looking through a phonics book or going through a workbook, you could try that little activity where you sort of play the game where he's matching the word with a picture. But if he's not at that stage yet and he doesn't know sounds and he can't blend, then I would say just read to him instead.
Amazing, thank you. And 2 more questions. So my son is 15 and dyslexic, and he finds reading and taking in what he's read very hard. What can I do to help?
It depends on where he's at, really. You know, I don't know exactly what he can or can't do. Speed, really. Is it his speed of reading? Probably. And in that case, then it's his comprehension. So it might be that you need to just work on his speed, and actually a lot of working on speed of reading is just about practicing over and over. I would say, is he reading texts at his level? Does he maybe need some different texts that are more at his level? We should never have children struggling through books. So if you feel like he's struggling through the books because he's making mistakes, maybe he needs to have an easier text so he is able to access it, therefore able to decode it and blend it, and then can build up some speed with those texts. So I would just maybe look with the school at what texts he's got. If it feels like it's a real struggle, I'd say it's too hard and you need to get something easier for him to build up some confidence, some speed, and therefore some comprehension.
Thank you. And last question. So my 7-year-old with SEN struggles with small words but not big words. I think he may be using his memory for big words that are being read to him. Should I go back to basics on phonics with him? Yeah,
you might. Yeah, I mean, if he's struggling with small words, I would just say to him, can you sound blend that word, and get him to go back to his phonics for sound blending. You know, even an old, like we did with the dinosaur Styracosaurus, we're using our phonics to look at those words. I don't know whether he's remembered some of those big ones kind of by sight, it might be, but I absolutely would get him to do some sound blending so you can check on his phonic knowledge, because it sort of sounds like he has got some memory of those words, but maybe not all of them. So I would definitely say go back to some phonics and see how his sound blending skills are.
Brilliant, thank you, Amy. And that brings us to the end